about you, but it just seems as if there's just something the Father wants to do. You could feel it. You could sense it in the praise and the worship. He's already moving. He's already at this point, he's done something. You already know it. You already know something has changed. Something has shifted. Amen. This entire week when I sat down and I began to look and to delve into this week's Torah portion and to try to glean what it was the Father would have to share this week, how many of you realize there's always something you can find, something that you'll see new that you haven't seen before, but there's a difference between just seeing something that is revelation knowledge and seeing something that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt is a sent word for today, for this season, for where you're at right now. There's a different level. We can glean understanding, we can glean knowledge, and we can have that word of knowledge, but there's a difference when all of a sudden it's something that the Father reveals because it's exactly what you need, where you're at right now, and it's that sent word. Amen? And so as I began to look, there was so many, oh, that looks really nice. That looks interesting. It looks amazing. I hadn't seen that before, but it was like, that's not really the way it's going. It's going over here. And so I pray that you are ready and that you're able to hear what I believe is a sent word from the Father. And I will go ahead and admonish you, just like David said, it is a challenge. It will cause you to look at some things differently than we have in the past, and it can be something that's difficult if we're not willing to put in the effort and the work to say, Father, change me. Amen. The title of this week's Torah portion is Vayera, and it's translated as, and he appeared. And it's amazing to me because our life should be bookmarked, if you will, by the appearances when Abba shows up on the scene and manifests himself in our life. It should be a life-changing experience. Amen. And we see that Abraham's life is marked consistently by appearances of the Father in his life, and it's because he led a lifestyle that he was one that was searching and seeking and always looking to enter in before the King. This week's Torah portion, it's taken from Genesis chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 24. And if you follow along with the Torah portions, you know that it's already started concerning the life of Abraham. And this week's portion, it's continuing on in the life of Abraham. And we find there's an encounter between Abraham and Yahweh. And when you read it from the English, we find that it's for a specific purpose, or so it seems. And Yahweh arrives to discuss the arrival of the promised son, Isaac. And we find that the entire time that Abraham has been called out, his life has always been marked and earmarked towards this goal of the promised son being given to Abraham. And yet at this point in time, he still has not seen that promise made manifest in his life. That fruit has not yet been born of the seed that was planted, the word that was given to him by Yahweh. How many of you happen to have been given a promise, a word, a seed that's been planted in you, and you have yet to see the fulfillment of that promise? I dare say probably all of us have. And so as we look at this, we find that this visitation is specifically about giving a date. 1 year from this visit, you're going to see the fulfillment of the promise I gave to you. Now that's powerful. From the English translations, we immediately assume that the purpose of this visit is to announce the birth date. Yet if we're willing to lay aside what we think we know about this encounter, I believe there was more purpose to this visit than meets the eye. And when you begin to look at it in the Hebrew text, I believe you're going to see that the reason Yahweh is visiting Abraham, it's not to announce that now it's going to be the fruition of the promise, but I believe instead the language reveals that it's to see if Abraham is ready for the manifestation of that promise, to see if he's capable and ready to see what Yahweh has promised him all those years ago. How many of you believe that perhaps maybe if Yahweh's given you a promise in your life, that maybe before we see the fruit of that promise, before we see the evidence, before we see it made manifest in our lives, that perhaps we're due a visitation as well? That maybe before Yahweh will allow that to produce and be released in your life, there's a set appointment that you have to make and meet with him. There's a visitation, there's an inspection. Do you think maybe Yahweh's shown up on the scene to see if Abraham is ready and capable of finally walking in the fulfillment of that promise? And when I began to look at this, I was reminded in the New Testament of the parable of the sower. And so often we focus on the fact that there was different types of ground where that seed, the word, was sown. But it was interesting to me because there's 3 different levels of harvest. Some reap 30-fold, some reap 60, and some reap 100-fold. All of them had a promise, all of them had a word, but a different level of harvest was seen in their life. Do you think that maybe the level of harvest we're going to see in our life is going to be based upon how capable we are of handling whatever promise He's given us? Do you think that maybe it's going to be based upon our commitment to that word, to that promise? Do you think it's going to be based upon our level of faith and how much we're willing to trust Him and walk out and understand that promise? Do you think that sometimes we've been guilty of being content at maybe the 30-fold because it produced something? That's good. We got something. We're doing a lot better than all those other stony ground and the ones that the birds stole the seed. We produce something, and we boast about that, and we're excited, and we're happy, and we're content. And yet He's reminding you, whoa, 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 that's the least that you can produce. There's more. And so we find that it becomes a challenge to you now. How many of you want to see 100-fold the promises that He has in your life? Amen? Well, I believe that what Yahweh wants to reveal to us here in this Torah portion is exactly that. And that's why He visited Abraham, who happens to be the father of faith. Abraham walked this out. What was interesting to me, though, is that when you look at this Torah portion, what is covered in these chapters, chapter 18 through chapter 22, you'll find that not only is Abraham visited by Yahweh, but so is Sodom and Gomorrah, and we find that Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed after this visitation. But what was interesting to me that had never caught my attention before, we know that in this encounter, Isaac is produced from this visitation. It's declared, the calendar is set, Isaac is coming, the promised son is going to arrive on the scene based off of this visitation that's just taken place. But as you continue to read, you'll find that Isaac's not the only one that is birthed from this visitation. Lot as well produces fruit after this visitation. From Lot, we find 2 sons are born, Moab and Ben-Ami, who becomes the father of the nation of Ammon. And as I began to look at this, I was like, well, Father, what's the pattern? What are you trying to show us here? And you'll notice that just as we begin to look and lay this foundation, Vayera, and He appeared. When Yahweh appears on the scene, we find in this Torah portion there's 3 different results that's going to happen when He appears. We find that one of the results is that the promises will bear fruit. They will be made manifest and evident in your life when He appears. The second one, we find that when He appears, we see destruction. Something's cut off. A word, a promise has the potential to be cut off. But we also see this third category, and we find that the fruit that's produced, there's a perversion. It's not righteous fruit. It's not good fruit. The sons of Lot were from an impure relationship. And you can go back and read here, after Sodom and Gomorrah, what takes place between Lot and his daughters. And there's a perversion that's produced. A mixture, a perverse fruit is born. And so we have to ask ourselves, my goodness, we all acknowledge that we want to see Him, we want to enter into His presence, we want to spend time with Him. Well, now we begin to see that anytime He appears, anytime you enter into His presence, there's going to be 3 different results from that encounter. It is either going to have the potential to produce the promises and the word that He planted in us, and it's going to bear fruit. There's the potential for that seed to be cut off, for it to be destroyed, or there's the potential that whatever we produce, it gets perverted. Some things get compromised. Some things get mixed and mingled in with that fruit. Well, let's look here at Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. It says, And Yahweh appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and he bowed himself toward the ground and said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. And if you read the entire chapter, you know that it's a divine encounter that Abraham and Sarah have with Yahweh Himself, and Yahweh reveals to them, as we already said, the set time for the promise to be made manifest in their life. But we're going to break this down. We're going to begin to look at this. And to be honest, we're not going to get very far in the actual Torah portion because there's a pattern. There's something that the Father has to show us right here. We're going to look at that word appeared. It's where we get the title of the Torah portion, Vayera. It comes from the root, Strong's number 7200, ra'ah in the Hebrew. Ra'ah means to see, to look at, to perceive, to consider. It can convey the idea of to choose something, to select, or to procure for oneself. And so we find that when we look at this term ra'ah, it seems to convey quite a bit concerning this encounter. It doesn't just mean that, oh, Abraham saw them, there they were coming, and he jumps up and runs and greets them, that they've arrived, he's seen them, but it also seems to detail that not only has Yahweh appeared and is being seen by Abraham, but it also begins to reveal to us why he's appeared. He's arrived to select, to choose, and to procure something as well after this encounter. And we find that a further inspection of this word reveals that ra'ah can also infer to cause someone to see something so that they may gain understanding, specifically to be shown a pattern. And so now when we see this statement, Vayera, and he appeared, it seems to be inferring that this encounter, that Yahweh has arrived on the scene specifically seeking an individual to be chosen, selected, procured for himself. And this individual that's about to be chosen is going to be entrusted with a specific pattern, plan, instructions, a specific word to be carried out. And if Abraham, upon inspection, is found capable, it seems that he's going to be the one that's going to be entrusted with this responsibility. How many of you realize Yahweh doesn't just give you a word, give you a promise just because? To do nothing with, to have no responsibility, and just, okay, I feel good because I heard something. That's not the reason he gives you the promises that he's given you in your life. He gives you a promise. He gives you a word. He speaks into your life because he expects you to then take that word, just like Adam did in the garden, to work it, to till it, to produce fruit from it. Why? For his glory and for his kingdom. Amen? And so we find that when he shows up on the scene and he begins to inspect Abraham and he's looking at Abraham, he's about to choose who's going to get the promised word planted in their life, and he's looking for an individual that's capable. He's looking for an individual that's going to show themselves diligent and committed to work that word, to guard that word, to see that word produce something and produce fruit. Amen? And so we find that if this is about a pattern being revealed that's about to be entrusted to Abraham, we have to ask then, what is required, and continue to look at what is this pattern about. From the context, it would seem that this pattern is somehow connected to the promises being made manifest, the seed or the word producing fruit, because we understand from the surface level of the text, that's what this is about. Abraham has been waiting, and you're going to see he's been waiting since he was given the promise. At this point, it has been 24 years. He's been waiting to see the manifestation of this promise. He's been waiting quite a while. And so we understand that if Yahweh's appearing, it has to do something, most likely, with the promise that he's been waiting for 24 years to see in the making. And so it's seen that this pattern that's about to be shown is all about the seed, the word, being able to produce fruit, to produce a harvest. So as we continue to look at this, we have to understand, what's this pattern? What is it that Yahweh is revealing to Abraham that somehow seems to be what turns the lock, that seems to be the key that unlocks that promise for Abraham to see it manifest in his life? The first reference of this term Vayera is found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 4. And it's interesting because anytime a term is used in the scriptures, the first time it is used, it's setting the precedent, it's setting the pattern. And what are we looking for? We're looking for the pattern that Yahweh is about to reveal to Abraham and entrust Abraham with. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 4, it says, "And Elohim saw Vayera, the light, that it was good, and Elohim divided the light from the darkness." In the Hebrew, it says, Vayera Elohim et haor ki tov vayavdel Elohim bein haor uvein hahoshek. And we're going to break down this verse because there is so much hidden right here. we find that there's a precedent, a pattern that's being set here for when there is a Vayera, for when there is an appearance. And what caught my attention is that when you look at this verse in the Hebrew, you'll find that there's a term that's used twice, and it's bookending the light. And it's the word ben. And it's seen there repeated in the scriptures, and we have it in red. Well, ben, when it's translated into English, it's just translated as from. But why is it in there twice? Well, let's look at this word in the Hebrew. From, Strong's number 996, bane, and it can mean between, among, in the midst of, or within. But it comes from the root word ben, which means to understand, to discern something, to consider it, to show oneself discerning or attentive. And we find that the basic concept is the ability to discern between situations or entities, which on the surface may seem similar. To understand and know a situation not for how it looks, but for what it really is. In other words, to have understanding, to have being, or bina, means that you're able to look at any given situation, but you're able to look beyond what you see with your natural eyes, what it may look like. It may look like that promise is never coming. It may look like there's no way they're going to be able to produce the promised son, but Yahweh's about to instruct Abraham regarding a pattern, and that pattern is going to require him to bina, to look with discernment and understanding, to show himself attentive to that promise and be able to discern the difference between what he sees with his natural eyes and what the Father has told him. Amen. It's interesting because the root word bin, discernment, understanding, is connected to the word bana, and it means to build or construct something. And the concept is that in order to build something, one must have the ability to plan and understand the processes needed to do so. If you have no clue how to build something, you have no clue how to use the tools that you've been given, even if you have all the materials, all the tools, but you don't have the understanding, my goodness, what kind of structure are you going to end up with if you don't have the understanding? We can understand that from the natural. My goodness, no one's going to want to walk in whatever is built by an individual that has no idea what they're doing. And yet the same thing overlaps and is conveyed in the spiritual sense as well. Abraham's been given a promise. Abraham's been given a word. But if he doesn't have the understanding on how to build on that promise, how to build on that word, my goodness, the potential then is for there to be some perversion. Something that gets messed up, something that gets twisted in the process, and it's not built correctly. The interesting thing is that not only does Bana refer to building a physical construction, but it also refers to building a family. Go figure. What is it that Abraham's waiting on? The promised son, the building of the family name. And so as we begin to plug this back into the Torah portion and Abraham, we find that if Yahweh has arrived in order to reveal something, then it's no accident that this pattern begins to see a connection to building a family, to building a house. And we find that it seems as if Yahweh is strategically drawing our attention to the fact that we can't build the house, we can't produce fruit, we can't see the promises made manifest if we're not able to walk in discernment and understanding. The ability to see beyond what something may look like and understand the true depths. Isn't it interesting that when we first looked at that word Vayera, the root of it can infer to see something in order to what? In order to gain understanding. This is why Yahweh has appeared on the scene. Abraham's been given a promise, but we're going to look at some examples and it'll be made evident he obviously hasn't quite walked in the full level of understanding those promises until after this encounter when Yahweh, I believe, shows him in detail the pattern. Proverbs chapter 4 verse 7 tells us, in all you're getting, get understanding. Why is this significant? In Genesis 15:5, we're told, speaking of Abraham, at that time Abram, and he brought him forth abroad and said, look now toward heaven and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. And we've looked at this verse countless times, and we understand that what he was showing Abraham is the message of the Torah, the message of redemption that's right here was also written in the heavenlies. And he was revealing to Abraham This is going to be your house. This is going to be the redemption of your seed. The promised son is not just Isaac. He was a type. He was a shadow picture, if you will, of the Messiah. This is what truly is the promise that Abraham's been given, and he's brought outside, and Yahweh begins to reveal to him the message that's written. But the term tell the stars, if thou be able to number them, it can mean to decipher it, to understand it, to declare it. It seems as if Abraham has to somehow glean some understanding of what that message is. There in Genesis 15:5, we find that Abraham is given a promise concerning his house. But what's interesting to me is that directly after this, in chapter 16, after he's given the promise, after he's given the word, after Yahweh Vayera, after Yahweh appears, takes him out, shows him this glorious message written in the heavens regarding his house, what does Abraham produce? What's the fruit of this encounter? Genesis 16, Abraham produces Ishmael, the son of the flesh. The one that is not the promised son. He got the promise. He supposedly understood the promise, and yet we find what is produced is not the right type of fruit off of this encounter. Instead, it's the fruit or a harvest of the flesh, something that's been compromised, something that's been twisted, and it's not quite at all what Yahweh intended. Could it be that Abraham did not walk in the proper understanding, the Bina at that point, regarding the promise, and so he produces something of his flesh and not of the spirit? And so we find that immediately when we see that, oh my goodness, there's a collective gasp. And we get real quiet because now all of a sudden Yahweh begins to get in our business, right? He begins to step on our toes, and we're like, whoa, wait a minute. Because the majority of us, I dare say, have probably been given a promise, been given a word at some point in our life, and when it didn't happen the way we thought it was going to, when it didn't happen when we thought it was going to happen, there's the potential for us to, I got this. I'll do this. I got a word, and that's not what's in question here. It's not whether you received a word or not, but it's how you're going to build on it, how you're going to handle it. Are we going to build on it with understanding, with discernment? Are we going to be committed to it? Are we going to allow Yahweh to teach us how to handle it? Or will we expose ourselves and instead produce a harvest, but it's not quite the right harvest? Instead, the flesh, the carnal man, is mixed in to that. And when we look at this, we understand that this didn't just affect Abraham. Abraham's line was going to produce the Messiah. And so we find that when Abraham produces something of his flesh, what he's just done is he's mixed and mingled, and he's cut off the one that would be righteous and holy and not mixed, not mingled. And so now we understand, my goodness, there's a lot at stake when we've been given a promise. How many realize that when you're given a promise, when you're given a word, and it begins to produce the right type of fruit in your life, it as well should be revealing the Messiah? That's what the good fruit does. It will reveal the characteristics and the identity of the Messiah to all those around you that see you producing that type of fruit. And yet when we become guilty, as Abraham did in this instance, and we begin to produce a fruit that's mixed with the flesh, and it's got some truth, but it's got a lot of other stuff mixed in with this, my goodness, what are we producing and revealing about who is the one that we supposedly are serving and received a word from? Amen? And so we find that this pattern is very important. There is a lot at stake. And that's why Yahweh allows Abraham to go on this journey, and it's for such this length of time because Abraham has to understand the weight of the word that he's been given. He has to walk in discernment. And we find here that Yahweh shows up to see, I believe, what's going to happen this time. It's the set time. It's time for that harvest to come forth. But what is Abraham going to produce? When Yahweh Vayera, when Yahweh appears to him, is he going to see an individual that now has spent the time to gain a proper understanding and is ready and capable to say, Hineni, here am I. I'm ready to receive, to work, to guard that word, that promise. Amen? We find that this visitation is specifically connected with Abraham gaining understanding, because without a proper understanding, we can't build on the promises or see them produced to their full potential in our life. Well, let's look a little bit further at this pattern in Genesis 1:4. We're told there in Genesis 1:4 that Yahweh Vayera, he saw the light, and immediately upon appearing on the scene, he begins to then divide the light from the darkness. And it seems this division, there's something to do with what's happening, that it's being done with discernment, with understanding, and it's being done in such a way in order to produce and build something. Well, let's look at this term, badal. It's the word divided. Strong's number 914. It means to divide, to separate, to make a distinction. It can convey the idea of to be set apart. And it was interesting because it's a similar concept to kadosh, to holy. Holy means to set something apart as well for a specific purpose. And this is what can be conveyed partly in this word badal, something that's being set apart. And the reason it's being set apart is for a specific purpose. And whenever you look at the creation account, it was interesting because each time there's a division in the creation account, it seems to be followed up by a corresponding filling of whatever it is that Yahweh has divided. And so when we see this term badal, it begins to take on even more meaning, that things are being separated and divided in order for fruit to be produced, in order for something to take place, in order for a harvest. Is it reasonable then to surmise that the purpose of the different elements of creation being divided, or badal, was in order to produce fruit, to be filled? And it's interesting because we see the same concept displayed in Adam and Eve. They're one, they're together, but then Yahweh divides them. They become two. Why? In order for the two to be made fruitful and reproduce and to yield a harvest. And we find that this is the exact promise that Abraham is currently waiting on seeing fulfilled in his life. The ability to be fruitful, to be filled. Well, when we look at this term badal, divided, we're going to break it down in the Hebrew. When you break this term apart, you have the letter beit, which means in, and the dalet lamed, two-letter root stem on the end of badal, can infer to draw something out. This root stem is seen in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5, and it says, "Counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out." So when we see this term badal, even though the basic definition can mean to divide, to separate something, which is taking place here in Genesis 1:4, but the picture of this word badal can literally infer in the drawing out. And it's specifically a drawing out that's associated with an individual who has understanding. In other words, in the drawing out with understanding, we find that the light is being drawn out. What is the light? It's something revealed, something seen, and it's being drawn out from something that was hidden or unseen. The word darkness here, the light is separated from the darkness, is hoshek. And it means darkness, obscurity, but it has the sense of something being hidden or obscure. And once again, the word picture helps us to define this word a little differently than we may have in the past. The letter ket represents the wall, a fenced-off place. It literally can infer a place of intimacy. Not just everyone is allowed beyond the wall of the ket. Only an individual who has the right to enter into that place of intimacy is going to get beyond that wall, that barrier. The sheen kaf on the root of hoshek is the word sok. It's where we get the word sukkah, sukkot. It's a dwelling place, a tabernacle. And so when you see this pattern being displayed to us in Genesis 1:4, we have to ask the question, could the pattern be that we're being shown here is that you're charged, and Abraham was charged with badal, with drawing out, with understanding the hidden mysteries and treasures that are only found in that place of intimacy that's the dwelling place of Yahweh. And we find that when you begin to draw out these treasures from the hidden place, from the secret place, that then all of a sudden it's revealed, it's brought to the light, it's seen, it's made manifest. In other words, the pattern that I believe Yahweh is showing to Abraham is the pattern of being able to look at the word that you've been given, but see beyond what it may seem like on the surface. And Abraham and you are being challenged to put forth the effort to literally plumb the depths of it. And to do that, if you'll take that time to put forth that effort, then we realize the pattern that when something is badal, when something is drawn out, the immediate result is then that it's filled. There's a harvest. Something's produced. Something will be produced from that word. And it seems as if it's the picture of that seed, that word that's planted. It's covered in darkness. It's hidden. It's in the secret place. And it's growing, but if you're not willing to go and begin to work it and to draw it out, that's all it's ever going to be. It's going to stay hidden, and there's not going to be anything produced from it. And yet, if you'll put forth the effort to begin to draw that out, then the pattern is that the light is going to be seen. It's going to produce something. It's going to be revealed. Amen? What was really interesting is that this phrase, this statement here in Genesis 1:4, we're told that the light is badal, divided from the darkness. And yet we find again the exact same statement being referenced in verse 18 in Genesis 1. It says, and it's speaking of the luminaries in the heavens, it says, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And Yahweh Elohim saw that it was good. And so we find that as we're looking at this in the creation account, this pattern that's being revealed to us, it seems as if the task of performing this division, the task of drawing something out, badal, it's entrusted to the luminaries, the lights that are created and placed in the heavens. It's placed in the charge of them. Well, it was interesting to me because in Genesis chapter 15, verse 5, we find that Yahweh specifically tells Abraham that those luminaries and the message within them are in regards to his house. And we find that numerous other times throughout the scriptures, there's references to these same luminaries, and it's always in association with the house of Abraham. In fact, in Joseph's dream, it's the sun, moon, and stars that will bow before him. Could it be connecting for us that when Yahweh says it's the job of these luminaries that are set in the heavens to draw out, to distinguish the light from the dark, to literally reveal something and cause it to be made fruitful, this becomes a part of the pattern that Abraham's being shown because that's your job. You're entrusted with that. You've been challenged. You've been given a word, but now it's up to you. Will you draw out in understanding and discernment something that will be revealed and made known and produce fruit? It was interesting to me that it seems as if Abraham has been charged and entrusted with this task of separating light from the darkness, just like the pattern that's been displayed above, of drawing out the mysteries and plumbing the depths of what Yahweh has revealed to him in order to see it produce in his life. And I was reminded of the verse that has been the mantra, if you will, of the ministry since we started, 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show yourself approved unto Elohim, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Why? Because you've been given a promise, you've been given a word, but if you're not going to do your due diligence, if you're not going to draw out the hidden mysteries and spend that time in intimacy with the king, putting forth the effort to go beyond the veil, to go beyond the wall, then you may not see that 100-fold. You may not see that 60-fold, and you may be really lucky if we see the 30-fold. And so we find that this is the pattern that Abraham's being shown. Abraham, you've been obedient. Abraham, you've left Ur of the Chaldees. You've left your family. You've completely been obedient and following this, but you were given a word, and it seems that up until this point, he hasn't fully understood what it meant to draw out the true meaning of it. And now we find that Yahweh shows up on the scene and he begins to reveal to him, I believe, this pattern. And we see that Abraham's obedient. Once he gets it, he gets it. In 1 year, there's fruit. In 1 year, there's a harvest. Amen? It's also no accident, I believe, that the luminaries are entrusted with this task. They're created on the 4th day. Well, it's quite interesting because it's also on the 4th day, or the 4,000th year, that Messiah appears bodily on the scene. And what does he do? He spends his entire ministry, badal, drawing out the hidden mysteries of the Torah, and he completely confounds the learned men of his day, and they can't understand, my goodness, how does he do this? He's doing what they were tasked with. He's fulfilling the pattern in the heavenlies. And what does it do? It becomes life to the people. And it reveals the true nature of who their king and their creator is. And the people begin to get healed, set free, and delivered because he's doing what he was tasked with, and it's producing fruit in the people. Amen? How many of you realize that if we'll take the time to do the same thing, regarding the word and the promises that you've been given in your life, not only is it going to affect you, not only is it going to affect your household, but it's going to have a ripple effect. And it'll affect all those around you, and it's going to begin to affect the circumstances, the place where you live, the place where you dwell, the place where you work. It's going to begin to cause that larger harvest. Amen? Let's look at this word light. It says that he separated the light from the hoshek, from the darkness. The word light, it's Strong's number 216, and it means light. But it's quite interesting because when you look there in the Hebrew, the first time it says the word light, that he vayera the light, it takes on a different form than when he separates the light from the darkness. The first time we see the word light there in verse 4, it's written in the Hebrew as Aleph Tav Haor, Et Haor. Aleph Tav representing and being symbolic of the Messiah himself, who in the book of Revelation states, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, I'm the beginning and the end, I'm the first and the last. Literally, I'm the Aleph and the Tav. So we see the Aleph Tav signifying the Messiah, the light, is what is seen here, is what is appearing here. But what caught my attention even beyond this is that this phrase, Aleph Tav Haor, has a numerical value in the Hebrew of 613. 613 is the number of commandments that we find that we've been given that are part of our covenant. It's also the value of the phrase Betorah, literally translated meaning in the Torah. How many of you realize that it's the Torah and the commandments that form this covenant that we've been given, and any word, any promise that Yahweh speaks to you, it's going to be based upon this right here. He will never speak a word into your life that is not going to be, this is the foundation. And so we find that the Torah is the written form of that same message that Abraham saw written in the heavenlies. He was charged to read it, to understand it, and to declare it. And we find there's a connection here. You're charged with the same thing. You're charged to read it, to understand it, and to declare it. How many realize that when he gives you a word, how do you think you're going to acquire understanding regarding that word? Where do you go? Where do you begin to look to acquire understanding and discernment regarding a word that you feel like the Father has given you? You go to the Betorah. You go in the Torah, in his word. And we find that it's when you go into the Torah in his word that you're going to begin to acquire understanding, and you'll learn how to take that word that you've been given and it'll begin to fill out, and you'll learn how to handle it. You'll learn how to handle the specific personal promises that he's spoken to you, and you'll be able to build on it in a correct manner, and you'll be able to draw out the fullness of it. Amen? It's also interesting because the value of this phrase, et haor, 613, is also the value of the phrase, ori ve Yeshua, my light and my salvation. And so we find that whenever we do that, whenever we're obedient to do that, guess who arrives on the scene and is seen made manifest in our life? My light and my salvation is now here. Amen? Do you think the significance here is that if we'll be obedient to spend time in intimacy with the King, to put forth the effort to enter into the set-apart place, to draw out those hidden treasures, that this is what's going to distinguish and separate the type of fruit that we bear and the amount of the harvest? How many of you realize that perhaps whenever we're given a word, if we don't do our due diligence to take it back to the Torah, to understand the boundaries of it, to understand how it's supposed to look, to understand and make sure it's being built on a good foundation, and instead we take that word and we choose to say, well, what does it mean to me? Well, all of a sudden, I begin to shift it. I begin to pervert it. It begins to change shape. And now, instead of producing the promised word and the fullness of the harvest, my goodness, you may end up with a Moab. You may end up with something else, and that'll be something of the flesh, because we didn't take it back and make sure to do our due diligence, and we didn't walk in understanding. That's going to leave a mark. And so as we look at this, to be given a word, to be given a promise, and to not handle it with the proper understanding, it has the potential to produce something of our flesh. It can be something that was good. It can be with good intentions. It can be something that you feel like, surely this is going to be something that will magnify the King. But if it's not based and done with understanding, some things will get twisted. And we find that to produce something of our flesh will be the results. But to understand that we've been charged with drawing it out, with building upon it with discernment and understanding, that's what will cause the Aleph Tav Ha'or, the Messiah, to become our light and our salvation. And how many of you realize that when we do that, regardless of what your circumstances may look like, regardless of what it may look like from the natural, when you become an individual that walks in understanding and can properly discern and handle the tasks that we've been charged with, guarding that word, guarding the promises, guarding the seed, then it's going to produce in its due season, and it's going to produce the right type of harvest. Amen? And so we find then that if we don't walk in that understanding concerning what he's spoken to us, there's a greater potential for us to mishandle some things. And we may try to force some things. We may try, no, it's going to fit. This is going to fit right here. And I'm just going to force it because I think this is the way it's going to be, and it will not work. Been there. It will not work. And so we find that he's showing Abraham this pattern. Abraham attempted to take the pattern and force it to fit his situation instead of speaking to his situation and saying, no, you're going to follow the pattern. And so we find that when that happens, he produces Ishmael, a son of the flesh, attempting to take the pattern he's shown and force it to fit into his natural situation that he sees with his natural eyes. And so we find that as we continue to look at this, it's no accident that this visitation, we're told exactly where it occurs. He tells you that Yahweh appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. Well, let's look at this term Mamre, because we understand that in the Hebrew, names have a meaning. This location is not just put there just because, oh, let's talk about some different geography points, and so you can see, oh, look, Abraham's kind of moved around. There's a reason. There's something specific about him being at Mamre when this happens. The word Mamre in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 4471. Mamre, and it's translated as meaning strength. According to the Jones Dictionary of the Old Testament proper names, the name Mamre can come from the root ra'ah, which is the root of the name of this Torah portion, Vayera, to see. And if it comes from this root, it would cause this name Mamre to be translated as from seeing, or from what is seen. Something happens here from what Abraham sees, from the pattern that he's shown, from when Yahweh shows up on the scene. Something is going to happen from what he saw. How many of you understand it's very significant to make sure you see right? To make sure you see correctly, to not let your eyes become spiritually dim so that you don't have understanding and discernment and you may see something wrong. In other words, Abraham's strength, his Mamre, his strength came from what was seen here. Yet if we're not walking in the proper understanding, we won't see correctly. Therefore, in the midst of difficult circumstances, we may be in danger of being unable to see the one who is our light and our salvation. And so all of this continues to come full circle. We must walk in understanding. In all your ways and all you're getting, get understanding. Why? Because if you can walk in understanding, you'll be able to see correctly. And that means regardless of what the naysayers around you may say, regardless of what your flesh may tell you, regardless of what your circumstances may say, you'll be able to see correctly. And because you see correctly, you'll be able to have strength. You will be strengthened by what you see, because who is it that you see? Regardless of what the natural says, you see your light and your salvation. Amen? Now, it's interesting to note that this word Mamre, it's spelled Mem, Resh, Aleph. Well, the root of it, the Mem, Resh, Aleph, if you rearrange those letters, in the Hebrew, they form the word Emer. Where is Emer? There she is. Emer means word, utterance, speech, promise, command. It was amazing to me because David and Anita both hit on the root of this word amar, and it goes beyond just the physical spoken word of Yahweh, but can even infer his thoughts and the mind of Yahweh. What does Abraham see at this location that gives him strength? He sees the mind of Yahweh concerning his house. Let this mind be in you. Abraham literally has a renewing of his mind at this location so that he can see correctly. It reminds me of Jeremiah 29:11, where Yahweh makes a statement, I know the thoughts that I think towards you. I know the Amar. I know what I am thinking towards you. And it's this location that he begins to reveal those thoughts to Abraham. And Abraham can now understand beyond a shadow of a doubt that those thoughts, those words, those promises, those prophetic utterances that Yahweh has spoken into his life were for his good and not for evil, to bring him to an expected destination, regardless of what it may have looked like from the natural, regardless of what it may have felt like, regardless of the difficulty he may have endured. There was an expected destination that he was headed to. Amen? And so we find that Abraham is able to draw strength even when from the natural it seemed like the promise was never coming, because he saw with proper understanding the word, the manifest presence of Yahweh. In fact, the word Mamre, those same letters can also form the word Mimra. And it's the word used by the sages to refer to the manifest presence of Yahweh. If you can see Yahweh, regardless of your physical circumstances, you will arrive at your expected destination, and that promise will bear fruit. Amen? Now, as we continue to look at this, it was interesting to me to begin to run some numbers, because we're told throughout Abraham's life at different points his age, how old he is when things begin to happen, and it's not an accident that he tells us this. There's something powerful, I believe, in the numbers, just like there is in the letters and the language itself. When you go and you begin to look and study this out, you'll find that Abraham at the time of this encounter is 99 years old, because 1 year from now, at the birth of Isaac, he's 100 in Genesis 21, verse 5. He is first given promises or a covenant from Yahweh and told to leave and go out, and given this mandate at the age of 75 in Genesis chapter 12. Meaning that at this point, when Yahweh Vayera, when Yahweh shows up on the scene, it's been 24 years since he was given a word, and it still has yet to produce the 100-fold fullness in his life. 24 in Hebrew is the numerical value of the letter Kaf, which has the value of 20, and the letter Dalet, which has the value of 4. Kaf represents possession, authority, inheritance. It's the palm of the hand and the sole of the foot. It doesn't just mean you have an inheritance and it's over there. It means it's in the hand. You have it. You possess it. You have authority over it. You have ownership of it. Amen? The Dalet is the door, the access point. And so the timing of this encounter is no accident. It's been 24 years. That number 24 indicates that it was the set time for Abraham to possess and access the door to the promises that the Father had given him, and to walk in the authority that would come with that. How many realize if we're not walking in discernment and we look at it from the natural, that seems like a really long time. And that seems like, man, you forgot me. You called me out and you just love me. I'm wandering around in the backside of this desert for 40 years and I still haven't seen the promised land. So if you're not walking in wisdom and discernment and understanding, then we may not understand the process that it's going to take for that seed to produce forth fruit. And we'll get weary and we won't guard it as much and we won't watch over it. We won't be as committed to that word because it's been a really long season. And so now you can understand, but if you'll walk in Bina, if you'll walk in understanding and discernment, you won't look at that length of time as something that's without merit. Instead, you'll look at that length of time and understand there's a set destination, and you'll understand the timing of it, and you'll be prepared that when Yahweh Vayera, when he shows up, I'm ready. I know it. The door is open. It's time. I'm about to walk through it and possess what you have for me. Amen? And yet, these two Hebrew letters, how many of you realize there's always a blessing and a cursing? These two Hebrew letters, it can be the Kaf and the Dalet, the hand possessing and walking through the door in order to access their promises and their inheritance and their possessions. But the Dalet Kaf Those two letters rearranged that way form the word, Strong's number 1790, the word dak, and it means to crush, to oppress, to be broken. It's from this same root stem that comes the word daka, and it describes, it's Strong's number 1795, and it describes a man who is emasculated or castrated, one who is incapable of producing seed or building the house or the family. And so we find that not only is this encounter between Abraham and Yahweh dealing with his physical seed, his physical offspring, but it also, more than that, is dealing with the spiritual seed, the promises and the word that he's been given. And so when we see that it's been 24 years, there's the picture, there's the pattern here. There's two potential outcomes regarding this visitation. And remember, it's not just Abraham that's visited. He will either be found capable of possessing and accessing the promises of Yahweh, or that seed, that word, those promises can be cut off and unable to be built upon. It's the set time. It was the divine encounter. It was the time for him to show himself either capable and ready or not interested and didn't care. And we find that it would be Abraham's response at this set time that was going to determine whether there was 100-fold harvest in his life of that promise or whether it was cut off and would not be built upon. It's no accident that the seed of Sodom and Gomorrah are cut off at the same time that Abraham is seeing his seed produce fruit. Walking in understanding, walking in discernment will be the difference between life and death, because you'll know when to be ready. Don't be caught sleeping. Amen? Now, it's interesting to see these patterns being revealed here, because remember at the very beginning, we talked about the fact that not only is Isaac born from this encounter, but Lot produces fruit as well. Lot is a picture of the fleshly, carnal man. In fact, he's circumcised from Abraham. He's removed off, and he chooses to go the way of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then later we find that Abraham follows this up with a physical circumcision in his life, which takes place directly before this Torah portion. We find that Lot produces seed as well in Genesis 19. It's from the incestuous relationship with his daughters, and we're told the names of these two individuals. Lot produces Moab, which is translated as meaning of his father, and Ben-Ami, which is translated as meaning son of my people. But the interesting thing is that when you look at these names, it's obvious they're named based off of the situation that comes about that they're birthed from. They both are proclaiming that they have come from this relationship of the father. But it's interesting because the root of Ben-Ami, it comes from the root stem people, but that comes from the root amam. Strong's number 6004, which means to dim, to darken, to grow dark. It also can have the sense of to be hard, to be difficult for someone to solve. And so when we see these two individuals, Moab and Ben-Ami, that are running right alongside, they're contemporaries with Isaac, both of them produce from this encounter, the Vayera, one a fruit of the flesh, one a fruit of the spirit, one the son of promise, the other is a counterfeit, and they're running neck and neck. Look at their names. Both their names, Moab and Ben-Ami, their names proudly declare that they are the fruit of their father. There's no hiding what they came out of. They're boldly declaring who they are. They're the fruit of their father. Well, who is their father? Lot. His name means a covering, a veil, something that will cause you to be unable to perceive Yahweh and his works clearly. And why are they unable to see and perceive clearly? The name Ben-Ami tells us from that root word amam, because it was too difficult. It was too hard to put forth the effort to walk in understanding and discernment. And so we find that they're content and proud to declare the works of the flesh instead. And we find that these two individuals become nations that will constantly attack and become a thorn in the side of Israel, the sons of promise. The works of your flesh, if not dealt with, will constantly be a thorn in your side if you don't learn to do like Abraham did and cut it off. Deal with it. And so we find that alongside with the son of promise, we have Moab and Ben-Ami, and they proudly proclaim, we have here, this is the son of the promise. This is the one that was written of. This is the word that Yahweh gave, made manifest 100-fold. And over here we have these two individuals proudly declaring their works of the flesh. And I was reminded in the New Testament when Yeshua makes the declaration, and he's talking to a group of individuals, and they're saying all the things that they did. We cast out devils. We fed the hungry. We did this. We did that. We did all these great works. And yet they're told, depart from me. I never knew you. In other words, they never entered in that place of intimacy to draw out the true intent that Yahweh had for them. They were content instead, obviously, to declare the works of their own flesh. And yet they're told, I didn't know you. You workers of iniquity, you workers of lawlessness, you never went back and understood the Torah, the commandments that this was supposed to be being built on. You didn't take the time to build this correctly. And so instead, there's the potential for us to instead continually proclaim the works of our flesh and say, instead of saying, hey, wait a minute, no, I'm not content with that. I want whatever it is that you have for me, and I'm going to put forth the effort, whether it's difficult, whether it's hard, I'm going to put forth the effort to see that, to draw it out, and to see that made manifest. Amen? We find that these two individuals stand in direct contrast to Isaac. Isaac is Strong's number 3327, Yitzchak, and it's translated as meaning he laughs. Breaking the name apart, though, there's some very powerful shadow pictures in his name. His name is spelled Yod, Zadi, Ket, Kuf. The Yod, Zadi root can infer something that bursts forth, something that's released, fruit produced, something that blooms forth. And it can also infer something that's released from captivity as well. The Zadi, Ket root can infer something dazzling, bright, clear, the light being seen, and it's clear and it's bright. The letter kuf on the end can mean to pierce. It can also infer time. It's a pictograph of the sun at the horizon. And so when we look at these individual letters that form the name of Isaac in the Hebrew language, it begins to paint a very powerful shadow picture of what this promise was in the life of Abraham. The picture of Isaac's name can declare that in due time, the fruit, the light, the promise would burst forth and be made bright and clear and evident. Those who are ruled by their flesh can't see it, nor can they understand it. But the one who is willing to walk in the understanding that's gleaned from the time spent in the presence of Yahweh will see his promises made clear, and they'll pierce through, they'll burst forth, producing what he has declared in your life. Amen? Yeshua makes a statement again in the New Testament. He says, having eyes they don't see, having ears they can't hear. They're ruled by their flesh. They don't understand the word that they've been given that's walking around in their midst. And yet the name of Abraham's promised son, when he finally understands, when he circumcises his flesh and says, I'm no longer going to produce anything from the flesh, I'm going to produce the promise, it becomes something that bursts forth, and it's clear, and it's brilliant, and it came forth in its due season. Amen? In Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, we're told, and let us not be weary in well-doing. Why? For in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Amen. We have often looked at the parable of the sower, and we've looked at the individuals that were unbelievers, and we're like, man, they got stony ground, they got stony hearts, they let the fowls of the air come and steal it, and yet the whole time we've been over here content to proclaim works of our flesh, and you're always saying, whoa, 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 wait a minute. There's something more. There's more required of you. If you'll take the time to draw it out, if you won't faint, if you won't allow your circumstances to dictate you, then in due season, you're going to see the promise made manifest in your life. And it's not just going to be the lower level. It's not just going to be a little bit, unless you're content with that. But he's promised you there's access to the 100-fold level in your life. But it's going to depend upon how bad do you want it? How much effort are you willing to put forth? How much do we want to say and hear him say in the end, well done, My good and faithful servant. You didn't faint. You didn't get distracted. You didn't go one way or the other. You stuck to the course with the promise and the word that you were given, and you built the house. Amen. Shabbat shalom.